So back in the 70s, Chevy had this ad campaign where they coined the phrase baseball, apple pie, and Chevrolet. And the point of the commercial was to kind of tie Chevrolet to the center of American culture, right? Now, one of the things that actually made it effective is that the automobile is pretty central to American culture. Really, no matter your background or where you come from, there's probably a car or two in your lifetime that's caught your eye. Each year, over 10 million Americans buy automobiles, generating over $940 billion in revenue in the United States in 2023 alone. Over 91.5% of American households have at least one car, and some homes have more cars than people. Now, buying a car is obviously a considerable financial decision. In this video, we're going to show you how the price tag of a car is just the tip of the proverbial iceberg, and we'll also illustrate how important it is to get your next car purchase done right. Alright, I'm going to cut right to the chase here. I think the best way to buy a car is to pay cash and to buy used. And I know that's not a particularly popular point of view. Only about 30% of American car buyers pay cash for their car. That is, they pay for the whole balance when they buy the car. The other 70% obviously borrow money to buy a car. But if you ask me, what is the single most destructive purchasing decision Americans make every year? It's the way we buy cars. And here's why. Over the course of 30 years, buying cars with cash instead of borrowing money to buy a new car would save the average American $1,114,000. That's not hyperbole, that's not a number I pulled out of the air, that's based on real data about how the average American buys a car, and it shows how woefully inefficient we are at the process. Let's take a look at how I calculated these savings. To begin, let's talk about how the average American buys a new car and how much they pay for it. As of October 2023, the average price of a new car in America was $47,936, and about 80% of new car buyers take out a loan for the new car with an average monthly payment of $729. Now, according to bankrate.com, the average term of an auto loan is a little over 5 years. But for our analysis, we're going to actually use 5 for a couple of reasons. One, it's just a lot easier than saying 5 years, 3 months. And the other is the average American actually has a turnover, or they have a new car purchase every 5 years. Okay, and speaking of interest, the average American will put down 20% on the balance of that new car. Their interest rate will be around 7%. And over the course of the loan, they'll pay a little under $7,000 in interest. If this process were repeated every 5 years for 30 years, the total impact to a person's net worth would be negative $173,125. Now, you may quickly note that a $48,000 car bought every 5 years 6 times would be around $300,000 spent. And you're right, but we're also assuming that at the end of every 5-year period, you'll trade in that 5-year-old car, so there would be some value for trading it in. So it's not like you're really spending $48,000 plus interest every 5 years. And if you're curious about depreciation, we depreciated the value of our new cars in this analysis at 19% in the first year, 12% in the second year, 10% in year 3, and 8% every year after that. All right, on to used cars. So the average used car price in America is $35,000, and around 75% of Americans buy used instead of new. Now, the good news is when people buy used, they do tend to pay cash more often. Around 40 to 50% of used car purchases are paid for with cash. Now, to do a comparison of used cars versus new cars purchased with debt, we had to pick a used car value. We settled on $20,000 for this video, and some of you may kind of furrow your brow a bit when I say $20,000, but you can absolutely find a good car for 20 grand. Around me, I did a search of a 50-mile radius using Auto Trader. I put in search criteria of cars with under 75,000 miles that were $20,000 or less, and it returned 544 search results. That was trucks, SUVs, minivans, cars, you name it. Lots of different brands. So you don't have unlimited options, but it's not as if with 20 grand there's nothing out there to pick. So going the used car route and paying $20,000 cash, you won't have any interest that you pay in addition to the car's value, but you will take a depreciation hit of $6,818 over the course of 5 years using that 8% depreciation rate we talked about earlier. If you repeated this process every 5 years for 30 years, your total cash outlay for used cars would be $40,910.22. Now, I've already said that buying a new car every 5 years for 30 years would cost you a little over $173,000. So we're $122,000 better off already just by buying a used car with cash. Now, that's well short of that $1,114,000 I spoke about at the beginning of the video, and we'll get to that in a minute. But first, I want to talk about an important financial characteristic of cars. The unfortunate truth is that with very few and uncommon circumstances, cars will always have a negative impact on your overall net worth. That's just the way it is. Between taxes, insurance, maintenance, depreciation, cars are a money pit. Over time, they will cost you more in value than they will generate. But think about houses on the other hand. Like a car, a house is a major expense. And you also have things like taxes, insurance, maintenance, all those costs that come with owning it. But if you buy a house, even if you borrow money to buy a house, which most people do, if you own it for a few years, odds are when you sell it, it'll actually be worth more than you paid for it. That's because a house is an appreciating asset, meaning it grows in value over time. This will never happen with a car because cars always go down in value as you own them. They're what we call a depreciating asset. And when you borrow money for a depreciating asset, you only amplify the pain and the expense that they bring into your life. So when you buy a depreciating asset, you might as well limit the damage as much as possible and buy something cheap and pay cash if you can. This is especially true about cars because they're so expensive, and if we borrow money, generally we stretch the expense out for many years. But now let's get back to that $1,114,000. Now we're going to do a little math here, but I'll try to put some numbers on the screen to help you keep up. We've already pointed out that the difference between buying a new car with debt versus buying a used car with cash is pretty significant. So looking at the used car again, to have $20,000 every 5 years, you'd need to save $333.33 every month for 60 months. $333.33 times 12 is $4,000. 4,000 times 5 years is 20 grand. Now that $333.33 is $395.67 less than the $729 you'd be paying every month for that new car. So if we take $333.33 and set it aside for our used car purchase every 5 years, we take the other $395.67 and invest it instead for 5 years. At the end of 5 years, we'd have just over $29,000. If you repeat this process for 30 years, you'll have over $981,000 saved. This is possible because the money you're investing every month, $395.67, is compounding in interest and growing in value exponentially. After we factor in the cost impact of depreciation, going the used car route for 30 years will generate a net benefit of $940,878. And that is $1,114,000 more than the negative $173,000 you'd have buying a new car with debt every 5 years for 30 years. And that is the true cost of buying a new car with debt versus buying used with cash. Now to help you visualize this, we have this in a graph on your screen now. As you can see, the red line for borrowing money for a new car descends. It actually looks very linear. It wouldn't look quite this linear if we zoomed in. Every 5 years, there's kind of a sudden dip followed by a more gradual slope. What I think is interesting is the way the white line that shows how you basically invest the money, the effect of compounding interest of time, it really takes that sharp turn upward. That's because compounding interest is doing its work. And if you look at the last 5 years, there's over $400,000 in growth in the last 5 years alone. Now, in case you're curious, what we assumed is that you would buy an S&P 500 index fund, which would return about 10.67% interest as it has since its inception in the 1950s, which is a very good but also a very attainable rate of return. I know because it's what I do myself. Now, I want to acknowledge also that there are a lot of variables here. You could move the needle one way to the left or right very easily. You could pay more for a used car, you could pay less for a used car. You keep the used car longer, you keep the new car longer. There's so many different levers you can pull. This just is an example. We couldn't cover every scenario because we don't want the video to be 2 hours long. And like I said earlier, we didn't include inflation because we really felt it would only serve to complicate things. But if inflation was factored in, the gap would be even wider over time. Finally, there are a few things we left in here that actually make the debt route look even more favorable than it would be in reality. The first reason is we didn't include taxes and insurance in any of our costs. Obviously, taxes and insurance are going to be much higher on a new car that's more expensive than a used car. Also, the trade-in value that we had where we depreciated the car's value over a few years was actually market value. So it would have left the value a little higher for a new car than it would have been in reality, again, making that gap wider. Like I said earlier, we used $20,000 in our example for a used car, but we could have used a lower number, which would have made the used car route with cash look even more favorable. And finally, we assumed you get a new car every 5 years. Truthfully, a car with under 75,000 miles on it used could last much more than 5 years. And the less often you actually repeat this cycle, the more money you'd really save. So should you actually use this strategy? Well, it depends on a lot of factors. I'm not suggesting that you should allocate $730 a month to cars, and whatever the difference is between what you actually spend and that $730 is what you save every month. It was just an example. However, Americans do spend over 50% of their income on houses and cars, just those two assets. Houses are an appreciating asset, so I'm not really focused on those, but cars being depreciating assets and borrowing money for them it's just killing our finances. And putting over half of your income in those two assets alone is not a recipe for success. Hopefully this will encourage you to take a holistic view at your budget. Look at all the things you're spending money on, not just cars, but also like phones, subscription services, clothing, everything that you buy. Every dollar that you can divert from spending and move into saving and investing is another dollar working in your favor. And as we showed you with compounding interest, the sky is really the limit. There are also very strategic ways to prioritize your finances. If you have other debts, say credit card debts, student loans, things like that, maybe you should focus on paying those off before you invest the money. It just depends on a lot of different factors. If you're not funding a 401k plan or an IRA or setting aside money in a tax advantage space for retirement, that's probably a step you should do before you open just a regular brokerage account. There's so many circumstances and we can't account for all of them. But at the end of the day, ultimately what you have to have is some portion of your money that you save. You pay yourself first, that you set aside for you so it has time to grow through compounding interest and you can actually build net worth. This might mean that you have to make choices that are abnormal, unpopular, or uncomfortable, but in the long run it will pay off. Another question you may be asking yourself is, can I ever buy a nice car? And the answer is yes. My intention was never to dissuade you from having a nice car. It's just wait and buy one when you can actually afford it. For me personally, my wife and I, we have owned 7 cars. I'm 42 and she's not quite 42. And over time, we've been able to slowly upgrade in cars. We started with a Honda Accord and a Ford Ranger, and then we moved to a Buick Enclave and a Chevy Silverado, which I still drive. Then my wife moved up from an Enclave into a really nice car recently. But we still pay cash for our cars because overall, it's a much better financial decision. Now, the goal here isn't to leave you in a junky car. It's to think about how you prioritize money and make sure that you're setting aside some for yourself first, not giving it to a car dealer. It does take some time and self-discipline, but in the long run, it's absolutely the better choice financially. Now, if you found this video helpful, please click like and subscribe so I can continue to make videos like this to help people. Also, if you have more questions about finances, you can check out our website, martinmoney.com. We also have tons more videos, which we'll link in the description and comments below. As always, we're so thankful for your interest in our videos. God bless and take care.